And nobody blowing a horn, which you could never get in Manhattan. Everybody just sitting quietly waiting for a police officer to wave them by, and a lot of people gathered around some of the supply trucks. Joey?
CNN's Richard Roth in Lower Manhattan at this hour.
Welcome back to our continuing coverage. I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington. Just want to report that when President Bush was visiting the site, the rubble today in Lower Manhattan, he met with the wife of a firefighter who has been confirmed to have died in this terrible tragedy. The wife presented President Bush with that firefighter's badge.
For the workers who work here, for the families who mourn.
Let's get an update right now on exactly what is happening at this moment. President Bush has toured Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. Early this evening, Mr. Bush rallied the rescue workers who are doing the arduous work of searching for survivors. The president said the whole nation stands with the people of New York. U.S. officials, meanwhile, tell CNN they have reason to believe that would-be terrorists still are in this country and may attempt to carry out further attacks. They say the terrorists they're speaking of may include more pilots. Today, the Justice Department released the names of 19 hijackers who struck on Tuesday. 7 were pilots. Around the United States today, Americans paused to remember the victims of Tuesday's attacks. And President Bush said the country will meet its responsibility to history. He's authorized the call-up of 50,000 reservists and has declared a state of national emergency. Bill Press and Tucker Carlson are standing by of our Crossfire team for more. Bill and Tucker?
Thanks, Wolf. It's been a day of mourning. The question, what next? How does America respond? Our conversation tonight with Larry Johnson, who's a former State Department counterterrorism official, and Jerry Bremer, who's the former chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. Bill Press.
Mr. Bremer, as Americans, all of us feel somehow we've been victims or wounded by these attacks, even though not directly. But for you, there was a very direct personal toll. Your company, Marsh McLennan, located in the South Tower of the World Trade Center. How badly were you hurt, and what is your company, how are you dealing with this?
We don't have final numbers yet, but we've obviously lost several hundreds of employees in this attack.
Your office was located in the South Tower, where?
Most of the people who were missing were in the South Tower, the high floors above, really at the place and above where the second aircraft hit.
And how many did you have working there? Employees?
Well, we had a total of about 1,700 employees in the 2 buildings.
Of which, how many are accounted for now?
We can account for all but about 450.
450 missing among that total that Wolf gave us a little earlier. A lot of us, the question that I hear from people that I talk to is, and I'm sure it's some of your employees too, how do we know it's over? I mean, the people who are in those planes are dead, but we haven't found the person who coordinated the attacks yet. There's been not one arrest yet of any other suspects. We know there must be other people in this country. Isn't it pretty clear that they are here and that they could very well strike again and that it's not over?
Well, I think it isn't over even, I mean, I would say it wouldn't even be over if we had already arrested all the people who did this, because we are, you know, people talk about this being another Pearl Harbor, and in a way it is in this sense. Pearl Harbor was the first battle of a long war, and this is the first battle of a long war, and like as in Pearl Harbor, we lost this battle. In fact, this is going to turn out to be worse than Pearl Harbor. But as in the last war, we're going to win in the end. But it's going to be a long campaign, as Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz said yesterday. This is not a one-time thing. We're not going to talk about retaliation. Retaliation implies a tit for tat. We're talking about a war, and it's a campaign. And in a campaign, there are going to be a lot of battles. We're going to win some of these battles. We're going to lose some of these battles. There are going to be more civilian casualties on both sides. More Americans will die. Maybe there are more of these guys in the U.S. now. I certainly hope we catch them if they are. But I think now, my sense, talking to people just as I move around in Washington and New York, is that the American people are ready to understand and to be led by the President in what is going to be a very difficult task.
Larry Johnson, let's talk about the long war that Mr. Bremer is referring to. There appears to be a consensus, A, that nabbing a few terrorist leaders won't do it, and B, that a ground war in Afghanistan is not likely to be fruitful. The implication is that the United States will move against a country. What country do you think that's likely to be?
The swamp where the mosquitoes in this case reside is Afghanistan. They're not only housing Osama bin Laden, the Egyptian, two of the most radical Egyptian groups, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Al-Gama Islamiyah, the Saudi Hezbollah has a presence there as well. So most of the groups that have been targeting and killing Americans are hiding out and receiving safe haven in Afghanistan. They've been training. Last year, 60% of the people who died in international terrorist attacks died in India. The people carrying out those attacks came from camps in Afghanistan that were passing through Pakistan. Pakistan's also on the list. And it's a bit of a conundrum because on the one hand, they've been our very best friend in helping turn over terrorists such as Ramzi Youssef, the bomber of the World Trade Center, Meryl Malkanzi, the fellow who assassinated CIA employees. That said, they've been supporting the Taliban, and they've got to make a very difficult choice. They've got to either be on our side or the wrong side.
But let's get Afghanistan specifically.
Sure.
Parts of it famously inaccessible, famously difficult to have any effect by air. Of course, we failed to kill Osama bin Laden a couple of years ago from the air.
Sure.
So what does that mean exactly for American forces? Does it mean sending ground troops into Afghanistan?
Well, I think the Bush administration is moving in the right fashion. Number one, we do not want to get in a situation where it's the United States against a Muslim country alone. That's point one. They're moving to build a coalition, and when the body count is done up at the World Trade Center, it's U.S., it's Europeans, it's Latin Americans, it's Asian, and it will also be Middle Easterners whose bodies lie in that rubble. And therefore, that's why this is an attack against the world. And so there you can ratchet it up to diplomatic pressure, but ultimately when we go into a military, one of the hesitations in the past, you have to have forward staging bases. Until we get Pakistan on board, that's difficult. But now with the Russians coming in, you're looking at countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan who are on the north border of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has got a real serious problem down the road.
I want to follow up there, Mr. Bremer, with Osama bin Laden. The Washington Post reports that the CIA has had basically a blank check to go after Osama bin Laden and either capture him or eliminate him since 1998. He has eluded us, the most powerful nation on earth. He's eluded us for the last 3 years. What makes us think that we could get him now?
You know, I think when we talk about the next steps, it's a lot more complicated than Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. Basically, we need a three-ringed strategy. The inner ring of that strategy is to find out who did this, and it looks like it was bin Laden, and punish him, basically eliminate him if we can, and any state which provided him support, which means in this case Afghanistan. And in my view, I differ from Larry. I think it is going to mean putting an expeditionary force into Afghanistan with all that entails. The next ring out is to deal with all of the other terrorist groups, both bin Laden's and others that are around the circle. There are a lot of states which support terrorism, and we've looked the other way for the last 8 years. Syria, for example, Lebanon, Pakistan, as Larry points out. We're going to have to get the international community to take seriously that, and that's the third ring. The third ring is to get a new international consensus that says terrorism is simply no longer acceptable. We had a pretty good international consensus during the 80s under American leadership. We've lost it a bit now in the 90s because of a feckless counterterrorist policy during the Clinton administration, and we're going to have to get it back. These three rings all have to operate together. It's a very difficult strategy, and the inner ring, as you said, Tucker, is militarily very difficult. I lived in Afghanistan. I know the people of Afghanistan, and I know the terrain, and they're both very tough. And there's already snow falling in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Going into Afghanistan has been, you know, the death of many expeditionary forces. So it's not an easy operation.
We can ask the Russians. But let me suggest that there may be a fourth ring, which is the American people. And right now they stand very strong, they stand very united. But I want to show you maybe a little contradiction. In our latest CNN poll asking American people what they would support, the first question, would you support strategic airstrikes against military targets? 85%, right, are there. Oppose only 11%. But you make that question, would you support massive bombings that might kill civilians? 48% favor, 46% oppose. We want to do it from the air, without any loss, without any American casualties.
Let me say this. This is basically the challenge of presidential leadership. The president's father faced the same kinds of polls before the Gulf War, and he turned it around entirely through an act of great presidential leadership in the fall of 1990. And this president now faces the similar challenge. He's got certainly a base of support, as you point out. Basically, it's not the fourth ring. It's the base on which all three rings are built. And he's got that base now, as you could see in the video clips of the reaction of the people down at the World Trade Center today. And now he's got the challenge as president to lead that forward, to do what is going to be done. It's going to be tough. We should not be kidding ourselves. There are going to be a lot more casualties.
Now, Mr. Johnson, nothing is scarier to most people than the idea of dying in a plane crash.
Sure.
What can we do to make air travel safer?
We need to do what we should have done 10 years ago, and there are 4 basic, very simple steps. Number 1, we need to eliminate the double standards that we have for aviation security. There's one set in place for international, another set in place domestic, and in fact, even domestically, you have one level for some airports and a different level. Stop the nonsense, because that's predicated on being able to predict what someone's going to do. We can't do that. Build one system, high security, that's the standard. Second, professionalize and federalize the folks that man the security checkpoints at the airports. Even though in this case the breakdown was not there, nonetheless we need to make sure that that's a professional position, because there's entirely too much turnover and too many unsophisticated people. Third, we need to have all the equipment that's available technologically from detecting weapons and detecting explosives at those airports, at all airports, not just some airports, at all airports. Because right now, what we do in some parts of the country, we assume that nobody's going to get on board a plane with a bomb, because people won't do that. Well, that assumption no longer holds. And the last thing we need to do is onboard the aircraft itself. We need to get rid of this concept of, I call it the bandit and the teller. Right now, if you go to hijack an airplane, the procedure is for the crew to take you to the front and you get into the cockpit with the pilot. We can no longer afford to do that. We need now, from this point forward, put a new door on there that cannot be breached for about 5 minutes. In that 5-minute period, the pilots can do 3 things. They can descend to a lower altitude. They can alert appropriate officials, and they can also open a lockbox which contains a firearm, and whoever comes through the door gets shot and killed.
I'm just struck that all the suggestions that you've just laid out, none of them have taken effect yet. In fact, the things that we've seen, eliminating electronic tickets, curbside baggage check-in, closing National Airport possibly for good, all strike me as ways to punish air travelers, but they don't. It's not clear how they're going to make air travel safer.
The FAA is in a tough position. They've got to demonstrate that they're doing something, but the reality is most of what they're doing is cosmetic gesture.
Yeah. Jerry, just following up on that, Larry mentioned the distinction between maybe different kind of airports and foreign travel and domestic travel. But domestic travel, I haven't heard anybody talk about executive jets. I mean, isn't that one great big hole in the whole network?
Well, there were a lot of failures.
There's no screening at these executive jet airports.
That's right. There's basically none. No, that's right. I mean, I fly on executive jets from time to time, and there's no screening. Correct.
I just want to add that to your list, that's all. But I want to ask you about intelligence, because you were chair of the National Commission on Terrorism. Here's a report that you released last June, actually.
A year ago, June.
A year ago, June 2000. I just want to read one sentence from your executive summary here. Today's terrorists seek to inflict mass casualties, and they are attempting to do so both overseas and on American soil. You point out there's a real problem with American intelligence. You make some 20 or more recommendations about changes that have to be made. It's been over a year and a half. How many of your recommendations have been adopted?
None that I'm aware of.
Why? Why not?
Well, in a way, you have to ask the administrations, both of them, Clinton, to whom we presented this report, and Bush, who's been in office since June, and Congress, because several of our recommendations were made to Congress. There has been some effort, there was some effort last October in Congress to try to get some bills through to put some of these recommendations in. It got tied up with the election, and then, of course, they came back in special session, and the election sort of overwhelmed everything. It's... in a way, it's sort of personally heartbreaking for me. I don't argue that if they'd done these things, this wouldn't have happened. I think that's not the case. But As we pointed out in this report, there was a sort of risk-adverse culture